The slap of truth came at 8:30 that morning.
My son said, "You can't bring Mom back. My wife's birthday only happens once a year."
I stood in the kitchen, holding my black tie, adjusting it for the third time, staring at the coffee cup my wife had used the day before she died. Her lipstick mark was still there, faint but unmistakable. 40 years of marriage reduced to a stain on porcelain, and a sentence that sliced through me cleaner than any knife ever could. The funeral was scheduled for 11:30 a.m. Her funeral. The woman who raised him, defended him, and loved him even when he didn't deserve it. In the background of the call, I heard music, laughter, balloons being inflated, his wife shouting about decorations. Life going on, loud and careless, while mine had just collapsed into silence. I didn't yell. I didn't beg. I didn't remind him of the nights his mother stayed up sewing his school clothes because we couldn't afford new ones. I didn't mention the chemo appointments he missed. I didn't talk about the way she asked for him in her final hours and tried to smile when he didn't come. I simply said, "Your mother's funeral is today." He sighed, annoyed, like it reminded him of an inconvenient meeting. "Dad, I told you yesterday. We've been planning this birthday for months. Caterers, band, everything's paid for. You understand, right?" Understand. That word echoed in my head long after the call ended and the dial tone buzzed in my ear. I stood there for exactly 3 minutes, staring at her reading glasses on the counter before I moved again. At the cemetery, people kept asking where my son was. I told them he had important commitments. 23 people came to honor my wife of 40 years. Neighbors, old friends, women from her garden club. The pastor spoke about family bonds and devotion. Dirt fell onto the casket in slow, deliberate thuds. With every sound, something inside me hardened. The space where my son should have stood felt larger than the grave itself. That evening, I came home to an empty house that still smelled like her shampoo. No humming from the kitchen. No quiet commentary from the living room television. Just silence settling into the walls we'd built together. I sat at my desk and opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside were folders, bank records, loan documents, tuition payments, down payments, wedding invoices. Years of financial decisions made in the name of love, family, and responsibility. I wasn't crying anymore. Grief had burned itself out, leaving something colder behind, clearer, more focused. At 8:12 the next morning, my phone rang again. My son's name lit up the screen. I already knew why he was calling. He needed something. And that was the moment everything changed. That was the moment I stopped being just a grieving father and started becoming the consequence he never believed would come. I didn't always live in a quiet house with a paid-off mortgage and a polished desk. There was a time when my wife and I counted coins on the kitchen table and argued over which bill could wait another week. We married young, with more faith than money, and a shared belief that if we worked hard enough, our son would never have to struggle the way we did. That belief shaped every decision we made for the next 40 years. I worked construction, long days, longer nights. 12, sometimes 16 hours a day. Weekends weren't rest days. They were opportunities. Overtime, side jobs, anything that brought extra cash home. My wife worked double shifts at a diner, then later at a medical office, always smiling, always telling me she was fine, even when her feet swelled and her back ached. This is 4 years later, we had written checks totaling $200,000 for tuition, housing, books, and fees. Not loans, not scholarships, cash we scraped together one careful month at a time. When he decided graduate school wasn't fulfilling and dropped out halfway through, we absorbed another $48,000 without complaint. He said he needed to find himself. We told him that was okay. Parents are supposed to understand. When Kyle and Megan announced they wanted to buy a house, they said they were just a little short on the down payment. Just a little turned out to be $350,000. I co-signed the mortgage, covered every dollar. I remember standing in the bank lobby, pen in hand, thinking how proud my wife would be that we could finally help our son start his adult life properly. Then came the wedding. Megan wanted perfection. The venue, the flowers, the band, the dress. My wife and I paid $75,000 for a single day that was supposed to symbolize family unity. Megan thanked us once, distracted, already scrolling through her phone. Kyle slapped me on the back and said, "I'll get you back someday, Dad." I never expected him to. The smaller expenses added up quietly. $35,000 for his first car, emergency transfers for vacations, business ideas that never quite took off, credit card balances that just needed a little help this month. My wife kept a notebook. I didn't know about it at the time. She wrote down everything we postponed so Kyle wouldn't have to. Anniversary dinners canceled, doctor appointments delayed, home repairs ignored. She never complained, but she recorded it all in careful handwriting, as if part of her knew someone would need proof one day. By the time I finally added it up, the total stopped me cold. $847,000. Nearly $1 million of our lives. Not inheritance, not generosity after death. This was money given while we were alive, healthy, still working, given with love, given with trust, given without conditions. We didn't raise Kyle to be wealthy. We raised him to be entitled. I see that now. We mistook providing for parenting. We mistook silence for support. Every time he failed to show up, we filled the gap with money. Every time he disappointed us, we made excuses for him. My wife especially protected him from consequences, the way she once protected him from scraped knees. "He's just busy," she would say. "He loves us. He just doesn't show it well." I wanted to believe her. Even when she was sick, even when chemo drained the color from her face, she defended him. When he skipped appointments, when he didn't return calls, when he promised to visit and never did. "She understands," he said once when I confronted him. "She knows I'm stressed." What she understood was sacrifice. What he understood was access. Sitting alone in my study after her funeral, surrounded by ledgers and receipts, I finally understood the truth my wife had been too kind to say out loud. We had raised a man who believed love came with no limits and no consequences, and that was our greatest mistake. Neglect doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps in quietly, disguised as busyness, ambition, and excuses that sound reasonable if you want them to. That's how it happened with Kyle. Not through cruelty at first, but through absence. It started with missed dinners. Sunday nights had always been ours. My wife cooked, Kyle came by, and we talked about nothing important. Those evenings slowly disappeared. There was always a reason. Deadlines, traffic. Megan had plans. We told ourselves it was normal. Young couples build their own routines. Then came forgotten dates. Birthdays passed with quick texts instead of visits. Holidays became rushed appearances, eyes glued to phones. When my wife began treatment, Kyle promised to be more present. He came once, maybe twice. After that, it was always next week. She understands, he said again. She doesn't want to be a burden. My wife smiled when I repeated his words to her, but I saw the disappointment she tried to hide. She stopped asking after a while. That hurt more than his absence ever could. The requests for money, however, never slowed. They grew more confident, less apologetic. Kyle stopped explaining why he needed help. He simply stated amounts. Megan would stand beside him, arms crossed, nodding as if our savings were a shared resource rather than something earned through decades of labor. One afternoon, she laughed when she saw my truck. "You still drive that?" she asked. "Kyle says you could afford something nicer." That was the first time I felt something crack inside me. We had helped them buy their house, furnish it, maintain their lifestyle. Yet somehow our modest choices had become a source of embarrassment. Megan started making suggestions. Renovations, investments, vacation properties they could easily manage with our backing. Kyle never disagreed with her. He never defended us. When my wife's health worsened, the decay became impossible to ignore. He missed her doctor appointments, missed test results, missed phone calls when she was scared. Once, after a long day at the hospital, she asked me quietly, "Do you think he's angry with me?" That question still haunts me. The woman who had given him everything wondered if she had done something wrong. I wanted to confront him. I wanted to demand explanations. But every time I considered it, my wife stopped me. "He doesn't mean to," she said. "He just doesn't realize." She protected him from accountability the same way she always had. The final months were the worst. Kyle visited less. Megan never came at all. When I called to ask if he could stop by, even briefly, he sounded irritated, like I was interrupting something important. "Dad, I'm juggling a lot right now," he said. "Can you handle this?" Handle this. As if caring for his dying mother was an inconvenience I had imposed on him. Still, I made excuses. Still, I believed there was time for him to step up. I believed he would show up when it truly mattered. That belief died slowly, long before the funeral. By the time my wife passed, I was already living with disappointment. The funeral was just the moment it became undeniable. Looking back, I see the pattern clearly. Kyle didn't become cruel overnight. He became comfortable. Comfortable taking. Comfortable assuming. Comfortable believing that love meant unlimited access and zero responsibility. Comfortable believing we would always cover the cost of his choices, financial or emotional. And we taught him that. Every ignored slight. Every silent acceptance. Every check written instead of a conversation. We trained him to believe that consequences were optional. By the time he chose his wife's birthday over his mother's funeral, the decay was complete. He didn't see it as betrayal. He saw it as efficiency. And that realization changed everything. The day my wife died was quiet. No dramatic last words, no final speeches, just a slow fading, like a light being dimmed by hands that were tired of holding on. I was there when it happened. I held her hand and felt the moment it went still. 40 years ended in a hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and fear. My first call was to our son. He didn't answer. I left a message, calm, controlled. I told him his mother was gone and that the funeral would be in 2 days. I asked him to call me back. He didn't call that night. He didn't call the next morning either. When he finally picked up, his voice sounded distracted, like I'd interrupted something trivial. "Yeah, Dad?" That was when I told him the funeral time. That was when I expected, foolishly, that something would shift, that grief would break through whatever bubble he was living in. Instead, he sighed. That sigh told me everything. "You can't bring Mom back," he said, "and Megan's birthday only happens once a year." For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. I asked him to repeat it. He did, slowly, patiently, as if explaining a basic concept to someone who didn't understand priorities. He talked about caterers, a band, guests already invited, money already spent. He talked about inconvenience and scheduling conflicts. He said abandoning Megan on her birthday would cause problems in his marriage. He never said he was sorry. He never said he loved her. He never said he would try. I stood there, listening to my son justify why his mother's funeral was less important than a party. When the call ended, I didn't throw anything. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I felt something worse. Clarity. At the funeral, I watched people scan the crowd, looking for him. They knew. Everyone knew a son should be there. Each question was a small cut. Is Kyle running late? Did he get held up at work? I answered with dignity, with restraint, with lies meant to protect what little remained of my wife's memory. Important commitments, I said. The pastor spoke about devotion, about family showing up when it matters most. I wondered if Kyle felt even a flicker of shame while balloons were being tied and candles lit for his wife's celebration. When the casket was lowered, I noticed the empty space beside me. That was the moment something inside me shut down completely. Grief didn't explode. It solidified. I buried my wife that day, and with her, I buried the version of my son I thought I had raised. That evening, my phone rang. Kyle. I already knew what he wanted before I answered. He didn't ask how I was holding up. He didn't ask how the service went. He didn't mention his mother at all. He talked about money, about unexpected costs, about credit card bills, about stress, about Megan being upset. He asked me to wire $15,000 as if nothing had happened, as if the ground hadn't closed over his mother's grave just hours earlier. That was the true betrayal. Not choosing a birthday over a funeral, but believing he could still ask for money afterward, believing there would be no consequence, believing love meant tolerance without limits. I told him no. It was the first time I ever had. The silence on the line was brief, then filled with anger, accusations, guilt, threats about distance and abandonment. I listened without reacting, because by then the decision had already been made. The funeral wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The night after the funeral, I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears until your thoughts grow louder than anything else. I sat in my study long after midnight, the desk lamp casting a small circle of light over stacks of paper I hadn't meant to touch yet. That's when I found my wife's notebook. She had hidden it in the back of a drawer, beneath old insurance policies and warranty manuals. Her handwriting was neat, careful, the same way she approached everything in life. Page after page documented sacrifices I had forgotten or chosen not to remember. Postponed anniversary dinner. Kyle needed money for car repairs. Canceled doctor appointment. Sent funds for Megan's business idea. Didn't tell Alan how worried I am about Kyle's attitude. That last line stopped me. I read it 3 times. My wife had seen this coming. She had felt the imbalance growing, but chose kindness over confrontation. She had loved our son more than she loved peace. And in doing so, she shielded him from reality. And now she was gone. There was no one left to soften the truth. By morning, my grief had transformed into something steadier. Purpose replaced despair. I knew exactly what needed to happen next. I called an attorney I'd worked with years earlier, a man who didn't deal in feelings, only facts and law. He listened quietly as I explained everything, from the funeral to the money request made less than 24 hours later. When I finished, there was a pause on the line. "You're not overreacting," he said. "You're late." That sentence hit harder than any insult my son had ever delivered. We met that afternoon. He laid out the options calmly. Change the will. Establish a foundation in my wife's name. Remove beneficiaries. Restructure ownership. Create barriers that emotion could no longer cross. Each step felt oddly satisfying, not because it hurt my son, but because it restored balance. For the first time in years, my actions matched reality instead of hope. We reviewed every document: retirement accounts, insurance policies, business assets, medical directives, powers of attorney. Every place where my son's name appeared was examined and one by one removed. I wasn't erasing him out of anger. I was correcting a mistake. My attorney asked the required questions. Was I of sound mind? Was I acting under duress? Did I understand the permanence of these decisions? I answered without hesitation. I had never been clearer. We drafted a new will. The primary beneficiary would be a charitable foundation bearing my wife's name. Scholarships, medical research, community support, causes she had believed in quietly, consistently, without needing recognition. My son would receive nothing, not as punishment, as consequence. When the documents were signed and witnessed, I felt something unexpected: relief. I walked out of that office lighter than I had in months. The future was no longer a source of anxiety. It was defined, structured, protected. That evening my phone rang again. My son. I let it go to voicemail. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty for ignoring him. Because I finally understood something my wife never allowed herself to say out loud. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's surrender. And I was done surrendering. I didn't confront my son after changing the will. I didn't warn him. I didn't threaten him. I didn't explain myself. That was the hardest part for someone like me, a man who had spent his entire life believing problems could be solved with honest conversations. But this wasn't a misunderstanding anymore. This was a pattern, and patterns don't break with words. They break with consequences. The first move was the quietest. My son worked for my company. He always had. It was something I used to feel proud of. A family business, passed down. A legacy built with sweat and long hours. What I had ignored for years were the reports buried in HR files, missed deadlines, inflated expense claims, projects reassigned because clients complained about his lack of follow-through. I had excused all of it. Family loyalty, I told myself. Now I read every document with different eyes. The next morning, I arrived at the office 2 hours earlier than usual. I asked HR to prepare the paperwork. No drama, no personal commentary, just facts. Performance issues, failure to meet expectations, termination effective immediately. When he walked in late, coffee in hand, joking with the receptionist like nothing in the world could touch him, I felt no anger, only certainty. He laughed when I told him, thought it was a joke. Then he saw the papers. Then he saw security waiting outside my office door. The look on his face wasn't heartbreak. It was disbelief, as if consequences were something that happened to other people. That afternoon, I made the second move. I called the bank. For years, I had guaranteed his mortgage, his credit lines, his business loans. The banker sounded relieved when I asked about the process to withdraw my guarantees. Apparently, they had been nervous for a while. Payments late, accounts stretched thin. I submitted the documents my attorney had prepared. 30 days' notice. Perfectly legal. Perfectly final. The third move was administrative, but no less important. I updated beneficiaries, closed joint access, removed my son's authority from medical decisions, changed emergency contacts. One form after another, each one sealing a door that had been left open for too long. Through all of this, I said nothing to him. I let him believe my silence meant forgiveness. He called, left voicemails, apologized without specifics, asked for patience, promised to make things right without explaining how. I ignored every call because I knew something he didn't. He still believed love meant rescue. He still believed I would step in at the last moment. I watched from a distance as the trap tightened. Credit cards declined. Phone calls from lenders. Awkward conversations with friends who suddenly stopped returning messages. His wife grew sharper, louder, more frantic. And still, I stayed silent. Silence is terrifying to people who have always been protected by noise. By the time he realized something was wrong, the ground beneath him was already shifting. The safety nets were gone. The assumptions he had built his life on were unraveling one by one. This wasn't revenge. This was gravity. And gravity doesn't announce itself before it pulls you down. For a while, my son still believed he was winning. That was the most revealing part of all. He assumed my silence meant weakness. He told himself I was grieving, confused, maybe even regretting my decision to say no. In his mind, this was just another phase I would smooth over with money and apologies. I could see it in the way he acted. He kept spending. Dinners out, weekend trips, gifts for his wife meant to calm her growing irritation. He posted photos online, smiling too widely, as if proof of success could be manufactured through angles and filters. Behind those photos, the cracks were widening. Bills went unpaid. Calls from banks were ignored. Letters piled up unopened on the kitchen counter of the house he didn't technically own without my guarantee. His wife grew sharper by the day. She blamed everyone but him, me, the economy, bad luck. She talked about lawsuits and rights, convinced that entitlement could substitute for stability. She had never learned the difference between access and ownership. Neither had he. He finally called me again, his tone rehearsed. "Dad, let's not let emotions ruin our relationship," he said. "We're family. We can work this out like adults." Adults. He said it as if adulthood meant demanding support without responsibility. I didn't respond. That infuriated him more than any argument ever could. When he showed up at my office unannounced, confidence still clung to him like a bad habit. He talked loudly, made sure people heard his name, acted as if he still belonged there. Security escorted him out. That was the first public humiliation. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it later. How his face flushed, how his wife screamed in the lobby, how employees he once ignored watched in silence as the illusion finally cracked. At home, the pressure intensified. The bank called about missed payments. Credit cards were frozen. The mortgage notice arrived, stamped final. He still didn't believe it. "This is temporary," he told his wife. "Dad always caves." That was his fatal miscalculation. He had mistaken patience for permission his entire life. By the time reality became undeniable, it was too late to negotiate. Friends stopped answering calls. Invitations dried up. Places that once welcomed them suddenly had no availability. The social world they relied on for validation turned cold with remarkable speed. Reputations travel faster than explanations, especially in communities that still value loyalty and respect. His wife broke first. She shouted, accused, threatened, demanded he fix it, demanded he make me comply. When that failed, she began to distance herself, emotionally at first, then physically. Entitlement has no loyalty when resources run out. Watching from afar, I felt no triumph, only inevitability. This was the result of years of arrogance built on someone else's labor. A life constructed on the assumption that consequences were optional. The moment he realized I wasn't stepping in was the moment fear replaced confidence. And fear, unlike arrogance, tells the truth. The collapse didn't begin with a single explosion. It started with doors quietly closing. The country club was the first. My son had spent years using that membership like a badge of arrival. Business lunches, weekend golf, dinners where appearances mattered more than substance. One afternoon he showed up as usual, confident smile in place, only to be told there was a temporary issue with his account. Temporary became permanent by the end of the week. Then came the restaurant reservations that suddenly weren't available. The social invitations that never arrived. The polite distance from people who once greeted him warmly. No explanations were given. None were needed. Word had traveled. In communities like ours, actions echo louder than excuses. A man who skips his mother's funeral doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. Not from people who still believe showing up matters. His wife felt it next. The boutique she loved treated her like a stranger. Her credit card declined in public. Sales associates who once rushed to help now looked through her as if she didn't exist. Entitlement doesn't survive humiliation well. At home, the notices arrived. Late payments, final warnings, default language printed in bold. The mortgage statement sat unopened for days before panic finally forced it into his hands. He called me again. This time there was no confidence left. He didn't apologize. He didn't reflect. He demanded. "You're destroying my life," he said. "You can't just pull everything out from under me." I listened calmly. I didn't argue, because this wasn't destruction. It was exposure. He had built his life on assumptions he never earned. All I had done was remove the scaffolding. The bank called me the following morning. They were professional, polite, nervous. My guarantee had been withdrawn. Without it, the risk profile changed overnight. Foreclosure proceedings were no longer hypothetical. I told them to proceed. That afternoon, his car was repossessed in broad daylight. Neighbors watched. Phones came out. Embarrassment became spectacle. His wife screamed at the tow truck driver like rage could reverse contracts. It couldn't. By evening, the power was shut off. Candles replaced chandeliers. Silence replaced background music. For the first time, they experienced what life felt like without buffers. He finally understood something fundamental. I wasn't angry. I wasn't punishing him. I was finished protecting him. And once protection ends, reality doesn't negotiate. Once the first wall fell, the rest followed quickly. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, taped to the front door like a public verdict. Bright paper, legal language, a date and time that didn't care about excuses or emotions. My son stood there staring at it for a long time, as if refusing to touch it could delay what was already inevitable. His wife didn't cry. She raged. She blamed the bank, me, fate, anyone but herself. She talked about lawsuits, about rights, about how unfair it all was. The louder she became, the clearer the truth revealed itself. She had never married a man. She had married a lifestyle, and that lifestyle was gone. Job interviews went nowhere. Calls weren't returned. Former contacts suddenly remembered they were too busy. In a town like ours, reputation isn't destroyed by gossip. It's destroyed by pattern. A man who skips his mother's funeral. A man who lives off money he didn't earn. A man who blames everyone else when the bill arrives. No resume can erase that. The car was already gone. The house was next. On the day of the auction, I didn't stand beside him. I watched from a distance, hands in my coat pockets, listening as strangers bid on the home my wife had once dreamed would hold grandchildren. The gavel came down. Sold. That sound ended his old life. His wife screamed, collapsed, accused. Security stepped in. The spectacle said more than any argument ever could. 2 weeks later, a moving truck pulled up to the house. It was small. Too small. Luxury items were packed like ordinary junk. Wedding gifts sold for cash. Jewelry disappeared first. Pride followed. Neighbors watched without offering help. Pity doesn't come easily to those who see betrayal clearly. That night, his wife delivered the final blow. She told him she hadn't signed up for this, that she deserved better, that she had options. She left with a suitcase and a phone already buzzing with someone else's attention. Entitlement never stays when resources disappear. Alone, he walked through empty rooms. In a kitchen drawer, he found something unexpected, a note from his mother. Simple, loving, forgiving. It broke him. For the first time, regret wasn't theoretical. It was real. He called me days later from a borrowed phone, voice stripped of arrogance, layered with desperation. He asked to see me, said he needed to talk, said he finally understood. I agreed, not because I owed him anything, but because collapse is meaningless without clarity. I met my son on a cold afternoon at a small park we used to visit when he was a boy. He looked older than his years, thinner, quieter. The confidence that once filled every sentence was gone, replaced by something raw and unpracticed. He apologized, not the casual kind he'd used before, not the kind that asked for forgiveness as a transaction. This one came with pauses, with shame, with the weight of understanding too late. He told me about the studio apartment above a laundromat, about the job at a gas station, about his wife leaving without looking back. He spoke like a man recounting someone else's life, still trying to distance himself from the consequences. I listened. When he finished, he waited for me to fix it. Old habits die hard. I told him the truth instead. I told him that his mother had worried about this future, that she had loved him deeply, but feared she had raised a man who confused love with entitlement. I told him the will had been changed, that the money was gone, that it wasn't coming back. He didn't argue. He cried. For the first time, I believed his regret was real. But regret doesn't undo damage. It only teaches, if you let it. I told him we could talk again someday, that reconciliation wasn't impossible, but it wouldn't be bought, rushed, or demanded. Change would have to come first. Not words, actions. In the months that followed, my life grew quieter in a different way, peaceful. I sold the house my wife and I had shared and donated the proceeds to a foundation bearing her name. Scholarships were created, medical research funded. Her kindness extended further in death than it ever could have through inheritance. I volunteered. I met people who gave without expecting returns. I built relationships that weren't transactional. For the first time in years, I felt whole. On the anniversary of her death, I brought daisies to her grave. I told her what I had done. I told her I hoped she understood. I told her I was finally at peace. I saw my son once more, months later, working behind a counter. Our eyes met. There was no bitterness left, only humility. That was enough. I drove home knowing something important. Justice isn't about cruelty. Revenge isn't about anger. And love without boundaries is weakness. Real love teaches responsibility. And sometimes the greatest gift a parent can give is the courage to stop giving.